The late afternoon light in Maple Hollow had that soft, honey gold color that made the cul-de-sac look peaceful, almost too perfect for the quiet war brewing under its manicured surface. Parents watered lawns, sprinklers hissed across trimmed grass, and children's laughter floated from the small community playground at the edge of the neighborhood. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place people dreamed about when they pictured safety. I used to believe that myself. My son Ethan, 10 years old, was kicking a soccer ball back and forth with his little sister Lily. She was 8, bright-eyed, and moved slower than other kids because of the braces strapped to her legs after years of surgeries. Watching them play always reminded me that peace wasn't about silence. It was about moments like this, small victories. My wife Hannah and I had moved here 2 years earlier. We wanted stability, a good school district, and a neighborhood where our kids could finally be kids without me worrying about my line of work following us home. Nobody here knew what I did. Officially, I was a consultant. Unofficially, I was a federal agent with the Department of Homeland Security. I specialized in organized crime, people who wore smiles while building empires of fear. The irony was not lost on me that even in a quiet HOA community, fear took new forms, and the sharpest embodiment of that fear was a woman named Karen Morrison, the self-appointed enforcer of everything trivial and sanctimonious in Maple Hollow. She had the kind of confidence that came from believing she was always right and the authority to prove it. Her clipboard was her weapon, her words ammunition. She had already complained that Lily's wheelchair ramp didn't match the aesthetic of the neighborhood. She'd called my wife twice over improperly colored curtains. I'd kept my head down. I wasn't here to make waves, but that day, all the restraint in the world wasn't going to matter. It started with a sound that sliced through the chatter and birdsong like lightning, a single, deafening crack. The ball Ethan had been chasing rolled toward the chain-link fence. He'd run to grab it only a few yards from Karen's backyard, where she was arguing with her husband over some garden tools. Witnesses later said she'd been drinking, half a bottle of Chardonnay already gone, her words slurred but her anger sharp. "Don't you come near my property," she screamed, even though Ethan hadn't crossed the line. Lily froze mid-step, her braces locking for balance. I was only halfway down the block talking to our neighbor when I heard the shot. My brain didn't register it as real at first. Then came Hannah's scream from somewhere behind me, and the world dropped into slow motion. Ethan's small body jerked backward, his hand clutching his shoulder. The soccer ball bounced away. Lily collapsed to her knees beside him, crying his name. I sprinted. Training kicked in, the kind that tells you exactly how long it takes to cover 30 yards, what angles bullets travel, where cover lies. But this wasn't a combat zone. It was a playground. There was no protocol for this kind of madness. Karen still stood behind her fence, a small revolver shaking in her hand. "He trespassed," she shouted hysterically. "He was stealing." "Drop the weapon!" I bellowed, drawing my concealed pistol, badge still hidden in my jacket. Neighbors gasped, phones came up, and the whole scene fractured into chaos. She blinked, realizing for the first time what she had done, but panic overrode reason. "He was dangerous!" she shrieked, the lie already forming. I stepped between her and my children, heart pounding, vision narrowing into a tunnel where only my son's blood mattered. Hannah knelt beside Ethan, pressing her hands over his wound. "It's okay, baby, you're okay," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "Call 911. I roared to anyone listening. "Tell them there's a child shot at Maple Hollow Park." Karen dropped the gun onto her porch, but didn't stop shouting. "You people don't follow the rules!" I told the HOA this would happen. I wanted to rush her, but years of discipline held me back. If I crossed that line, I'd lose everything, my badge, my credibility, my son's trust. So I stayed by Ethan, pressing my jacket against the wound. The sirens came fast. Local patrol cars screeched to a halt, lights spinning red and blue across the cul-de-sac. Paramedics rushed in, lifting Ethan onto a stretcher as I held his hand. "Dad," he whispered weakly. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, son," I said, voice breaking. "You did everything right." When they loaded him into the ambulance, Hannah climbed in beside him. I tried to follow, but a uniformed officer stopped me. "Sir, we need your statement." She shot my son. I said, my tone flat, emotion burning beneath it. You can get my statement at the hospital. Sir, please. That's when Karen started her performance, clutching her chest dramatically as she told officers, "He threatened me. That man pulled a gun on me." I turned, slowly, locking eyes with her. My voice was calm, lethal. You have no idea who you're lying to. The officers looked uncertain, caught between two narratives. I reached into my pocket, flipped open my badge. The sunlight glinted off the gold. Federal agent, DHS Criminal Investigations Division. The silence that followed could have cracked glass. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish, the blood draining from her face. Officers, I said evenly, secure her weapon, record every word she's saying, and make sure she doesn't leave this street. My son is on his way to St. Luke's Hospital. I'll cooperate fully after my family is safe. No one argued. I drove behind the ambulance with sirens in my head louder than the ones on the road. Every passing light turned the windshield into a strobe of guilt and fury. At the hospital, surgeons wheeled Ethan into the emergency bay. The bullet had grazed his upper shoulder, millimeters from a major artery. It was a miracle. Hannah sat in the waiting room, blood still on her hands, trembling but silent. I'm going to handle this, I told her. She looked up, eyes red. Don't do anything reckless. I kissed her forehead. I'm not. I'm going to do my job. Because now it wasn't just personal, it was criminal. And Karen Morrison was about to find out what it meant to pick a fight with someone who enforces federal law for a living. The hospital's emergency waiting room was one of those sterile spaces where time itself seemed to freeze. White walls, plastic chairs, and a television looping some local news broadcast no one cared about. Hannah sat with her head in her hands, and my daughter Lily clutched her stuffed bear, silent tears tracing her cheeks. I paced like a caged animal, half in father mode, half in agent mode. Ethan was stable now. The bullet had gone clean through his shoulder, missing bone and artery. The surgeon said it would leave a scar, but he'd recover fully. That knowledge should have calmed me, but it didn't. The rage that sat under my skin wasn't the kind that faded with relief. It was the kind that demanded resolution. I'd seen monsters before. Cartel enforcers, arms smugglers, cybercriminals who'd ruined lives without blinking. But none of them had ever felt as personally vile as Karen Morrison, the suburban tyrant who'd just tried to justify shooting a 10-year-old. I called Captain Jameson, a friend and local police contact, and told him exactly what happened. He listened quietly, then said, "Stay at the hospital. I'll handle the scene, but just so you know, the HOA board's already spinning their own version." I clenched my jaw. Of course they are. Yeah, he sighed. Karen's saying your kid trespassed and she feared for her safety. She's trying to invoke self-defense. She fired at a child across a fence, I said flatly. That's not fear, that's delusion. I know. But the HOA president's already called her lawyer. This won't stay small, it never does, I thought bitterly. Not when people like Karen think the rules don't apply to them. By morning, the story had started to spread. First among the neighbors, then the local news. Neighborhood dispute leads to tragic shooting, one anchor said. They didn't name names, but I could tell how the narrative was forming. Karen's husband had gone on record saying she acted in a moment of panic. The HOA board released a vague statement about regrettable incidents arising from misunderstandings. Was done being quiet. After Ethan was moved to a recovery room, I kissed his forehead and told Hannah I'd be back soon. Then I drove straight to the Maple Hollow HOA office, a spotless little building attached to the clubhouse, where Karen and her board usually handed out fines for things like non-regulation garden ornaments. When I entered, the board was in the middle of a closed-door meeting. The moment I opened that door, the room fell silent. 6 pairs of eyes turned toward me, and Karen looked like she'd seen a ghost. "What are you doing here?" she snapped, trying to sound indignant, but her voice quivered. "I'm here to make sure none of you destroy evidence or fabricate statements," I said evenly, flashing my badge. "Department of Homeland Security, Criminal Investigations Division." The color drained from several faces instantly. Karen tried to recover, leaning back in her chair. "This is a community matter, this is a federal matter," I interrupted. You discharged an unregistered firearm, hit a minor, and are now attempting to manipulate a police report through an organized HOA council. That qualifies as obstruction and conspiracy. The room went so quiet you could hear the air conditioner hum. The vice president of the HOA, a balding man named Rick, stammered, "We didn't mean to interfere, Agent, Reynolds," I said. "And yes, you did. You released a statement minimizing a shooting. Did you consult police before you did that?" Rick swallowed. "Karen told us—" "That's enough," Karen snapped. "I will not be intimidated by some—" I slammed a folder on the table, the sound cracking like thunder. Inside were printed photos of my son on a hospital bed, tubes and all. "That's what you did. You shot a child. You pointed a gun over a fence and fired at a 10-year-old who was chasing a soccer ball. And you think you get to spin this into a neighborhood misunderstanding." Her defiance faltered. For a second, her face twisted, not in remorse, but in fury that she was being cornered. "You can't threaten me," she hissed. "I'll have your badge for this." "Try," I said coldly. "Every second you talk digs your hole deeper. You think you're powerful because you run an HOA board. You have no idea what real accountability looks like." Rick and the others avoided her gaze. I'd seen this dynamic before, bullies losing their grip the moment they realize they're not the apex predator anymore. "Here's what's going to happen," I continued. "You're going to cease all public statements. You're going to preserve any footage from your security cameras, phones, and email threads. If I find out anything's been deleted, I'll charge each of you with evidence tampering." Karen stood up, shaking with anger. "You're out of line!" I leaned closer, lowering my voice to a razor's edge. "You shot my son. The only reason you're not in cuffs right now is because I'm giving local law enforcement the professional courtesy of handling this first. But make no mistake, I'm watching every move you make." Then I turned and walked out. Outside, I called Jameson again. "You'll want to get a warrant for Morrison's home. She's going to delete everything she can." "Already on it," he said. "You were right. Her camera system shows Ethan never crossed the fence." The round was fired from her deck. "She's toast." Relief washed through me, but only partially. Justice wasn't done until she was behind bars. That afternoon, 2 patrol cars and a forensic van rolled up to Karen's house. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as officers taped off her porch. When she tried to protest, Jameson himself read her the charges: aggravated assault with a firearm, reckless endangerment, and obstruction of justice. She screamed about conspiracies, claiming she was being targeted, that the federal guy was out to destroy her. I stood across the street, arms folded, watching quietly. Hannah had begged me to stay calm, to not make a scene, and I promised her I wouldn't. But seeing Karen handcuffed, the gun bagged as evidence, felt like a wound beginning to close. Lily stood beside me, holding my hand. She whispered, "Daddy, why did she hurt Ethan?" I crouched down, meeting her eyes. Sometimes people think rules make them better than others, but they don't. They just make them blind. She nodded softly, not fully understanding, but finding comfort in the tone. The media vans arrived an hour later. A reporter shoved a microphone toward me, asking, "Sir, are you the victim's father? Do you have a statement about the arrest?" I looked directly into the camera. No child should have to fear for their life in a neighborhood playground. My family will let the justice system do what it's meant to do. Then I walked away. That evening, back at the hospital, Ethan woke up fully for the first time. His voice was groggy, but he smiled when he saw us. "Hey, did I miss soccer practice?" Hannah laughed through tears, brushing his hair back. "You're grounded from running for a few weeks, mister." I stood there, taking in the scene. The monitors beeping steadily, the smell of antiseptic, the quiet miracle that my son was alive. But underneath the relief, my instincts told me something else. Karen Morrison wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. People like her, entitled, manipulative, they didn't stop when they were cornered. They doubled down. And sure enough, before the night was over, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. When I answered, a distorted female voice said, "You think you can ruin me, Agent Reynolds? This isn't over." Then the line went dead. I stared at the phone, cold fury settling into something sharper. Resolve. She wanted a war? She was about to learn what happens when you pick one with someone who lives by the law and knows how to enforce it. The following week was a blur of hospital visits, police reports, and interviews with investigators. Ethan was recovering faster than anyone expected. His resilience humbled me. Every time I saw the bandage on his shoulder, though, I felt that familiar spark of anger flare up again. It wasn't vengeance I wanted, it was certainty. I needed to make sure Karen Morrison could never hurt another family again. Officially, the case belonged to the county prosecutor, but unofficially, my clearance and position gave me access to things most civilians never saw. I spent evenings combing through records, her firearms license history, HOA emails, complaint logs. What I found painted a disturbing picture. Dozens of reports where she'd threatened neighbors, harassed families about rule violations, and once even called animal control on a service dog. She'd been escalating for years, and nobody stopped her because she hid behind the HOA's bureaucracy. One morning, as I dropped Lily at physical therapy, my phone buzzed. It was Captain Jameson. "You were right," he said without preamble. "Forensics pulled fingerprints off that revolver. The serial numbers scratched off, but we traced it to a pawn shop in Pine Ridge. She bought it under a fake name." I exhaled slowly. Illegal purchase, false identity, and use of an unregistered firearm. That adds federal charges. "That's what I figured you'd say," he replied. "Mind if my detectives coordinate with your office?" "Do it. I'll get the paperwork moving." When I hung up, I felt the shift. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute. It was crossing into the territory I lived in professionally. Interstate trafficking, weapons violations, fraud. And Karen Morrison was right in the middle of it. 2 days later, I sat across from the county prosecutor, a composed woman named Alicia Davenport, in her downtown office. Stacks of case files surrounded her desk like ramparts. She looked up as I entered. "Agent Reynolds," she greeted, gesturing to a chair. "I heard you've been doing some of our legwork." I shrugged lightly. "Old habits." I wanted to be thorough. "I've reviewed the evidence. She's facing multiple felonies," Alicia continued, flipping through the folder. "Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, unregistered firearm, false statements. But you know how defense attorneys are? They'll argue diminished capacity or self-defense." "She shot across a fence," I said evenly. "We have footage." She nodded. "I've seen it. It's strong. But public perception matters. She's already hired a PR firm. There's talk she'll claim your son was bullying her grandchild." The air in the room cooled a few degrees. "My son was kicking a soccer ball." "I know," Alicia said softly. "We'll counter it. I just want you prepared." I leaned back. "Then we build the narrative before she does." Her eyebrow rose. "You sound like a prosecutor." "I've spent my career watching criminals weaponize public sympathy. I'm not letting her turn a playground shooting into a pity story." A small smile tugged at her lips. "In that case, I'd appreciate your cooperation as a federal witness. Your experience could help frame this the right way." Consider it done. That evening, I returned home to find Hannah sitting on the couch, phone in hand, her expression pale. "You need to hear this," she said, pressing play. The voicemail was garbled, but chillingly clear. "Drop the charges or someone gets hurt. You think your badge protects you?" I recognized the voice modulation immediately. It was the same pattern from the earlier anonymous call. "Karen had found a way to reach us again. Did you report it?" I asked quietly. "Already did," she said, showing me the police case number. I pulled her close, trying to absorb her shaking. "She's getting desperate." "That's good. It means she's losing control." Lily came down the stairs, rubbing her eyes. "Mommy, Daddy, are the police coming again?" Hannah forced a smile. "Everything's okay, sweetheart. Go back to bed." When Lily was gone, I said, "I'm moving you and the kids to a hotel tonight. Somewhere out of town. I'll have federal security on standby." She wanted to protest, but one look at my face stopped her. "All right," she whispered. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I always am," I lied. The next morning, Karen appeared in court for her arraignment. The courtroom was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as she walked in, wearing an expensive blazer and a rehearsed look of remorse. Her lawyer, a slick man in his 50s, guided her to the defendant's table. I sat behind the prosecution bench, watching quietly. When she turned and saw me, something flickered in her eyes. Fear, resentment, maybe disbelief that I was still standing. The judge entered and everyone rose. The proceedings were straightforward at first. Charges read, pleas entered, bail discussions. Then the defense attorney stood. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "my client acted in self-defense. The alleged victim's father, a federal agent, brandished a weapon at her moments after the incident. This has created a hostile environment. We request immediate dismissal or, at minimum, supervised release." A ripple of murmurs filled the courtroom. I felt every muscle tighten but stayed silent. Alicia Davenport rose calmly. "Your Honor, the defense conveniently omits that the defendant fired into a public playground, striking an unarmed child. Agent Reynolds did not brandish a weapon. He lawfully secured the scene after identifying himself. Moreover, the weapon used was unregistered and purchased illegally. We move for full remand," Karen's lawyer scoffed. "You're making her out to be a monster." "She is a monster," I thought, clenching my jaw. The judge banged her gavel lightly. "Enough. Based on the evidence presented, the court denies bail." "Defendant will remain in custody pending trial." Gasps echoed through the room. Karen's composure cracked. She turned to her lawyer in disbelief. "You said they wouldn't—" "Sit down," he hissed. As deputies moved to escort her out, she turned her head toward me. "You'll regret this," she shouted, voice breaking. I didn't respond. The rule in my profession was simple. Never engage with someone trying to pull you into their chaos. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. "Agent Reynolds, is it true you drew your gun?" One shouted. Another yelled, "How's your son doing?" I stopped for a moment, met their gazes, and said, "My son survived because good people did their jobs." That's all I have to say. Then I walked away, letting the noise fade behind me. Later that day, Jameson called again. "We found something in her house. You'll want to hear this." At the precinct, he laid out a folder of photographs. Inside were screenshots of Karen's emails, threads discussing getting rid of problem families, taking back control of the neighborhood, and, shockingly, a list of residents she'd targeted, including us. "She was keeping files," Jameson said grimly. "Photos of you, your wife, even the kids. Dates, times, routines." My stomach turned cold. This wasn't just an impulse. She planned intimidation. Looks that way. We also found a second gun hidden under a floorboard. Same pawn shop connection. That sealed it. Any shred of self-defense was gone. I called Alicia Davenport. "We need to escalate this. These files show premeditation." "I'll file the motion first thing tomorrow," she promised. "This changes everything." As I left the precinct, night had fallen over Maple Hollow. The once quiet neighborhood was different now. Windows drawn, driveways empty. Fear had replaced comfort, but fear didn't rule me. Not anymore. The following morning, I returned to the hospital to check on Ethan. He was sitting up, playing a video game, his arm in a sling. When he saw me, his face lit up. "Dad! The nurse says I might go home next week." I smiled, sitting beside him. "That's the best news I've heard all month." He paused his game, growing serious. "Is the lady in jail?" "Yes," I said. "And she's not getting out?" He nodded slowly. "Good." Then, after a beat, "Can we move somewhere with a bigger yard? Without crazy neighbors?" I laughed softly, ruffling his hair. "Yeah, buddy. We can do that." Behind the laughter, though, my mind was already turning toward the trial ahead. I knew Karen's type. They never admitted guilt, never showed remorse. But with the evidence piling up and her threats recorded, this time the system had everything it needed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling she had one more move left. People like her didn't go down quietly. That night, as I finally sat on the edge of my bed for the first real moment of rest in days, a message buzzed onto my phone. It was from an unknown number again. But this one wasn't a threat. It was a photo. A blurry image of Karen in an orange jumpsuit, handcuffed, being led into a transport van. No caption, just proof that justice, at least for now, was catching up. I didn't know who sent it. Maybe a sympathetic officer. Maybe someone in the DA's office. But it was enough to let me exhale for the first time in a week. Karen Morrison had destroyed the illusion of peace in Maple Hollow. But she had also reminded me why I chose this job in the first place, because someone has to stand between chaos and the innocent, and this time, that line was personal. The courthouse looked different on the day of the trial. Same marble floors, same polished benches, but the air carried a weight you could almost taste. News trucks idled outside, reporters fanned across the steps, and uniformed officers stood at every door. Inside, the gallery was packed with neighbors, journalists, and curious faces who wanted to see the infamous HOA Karen get her reckoning. I sat in the front row beside Hannah, who squeezed my hand hard enough to hurt. Ethan, still recovering but determined, sat quietly next to her. Lily was at home with my sister. There was no reason for her to witness any of this. I'd testified the day before, recounting the sequence of events with the detached precision of a federal report. But nothing about this felt procedural anymore. This was personal closure wrapped in due process. Karen entered flanked by 2 deputies. Gone was the smug authority of the neighborhood tyrant. The crisp suits and expensive jewelry had been replaced by a drab county-issue jumpsuit. Still, she tried to look composed, chin high, eyes scanning the room until they found me. For a heartbeat, her expression faltered, an instant of recognition that whatever control she once had was truly gone. The prosecutor, Alicia Davenport, began her closing argument. The defendant did not act in fear. She acted in anger. She discharged a firearm toward a child because she believed her authority as a homeowners association officer gave her the right to enforce rules with violence. That belief nearly cost a 10-year-old his life. Her voice was steady, sharp, each word punctuated by the images projected behind her. Photos of the playground, the fence, the bullet hole in Ethan's shirt. The jury watched in silence. Karen's lawyer stood next. He leaned heavily on his podium, voice oily but calm. My client regrets what happened. She was intoxicated, frightened, and provoked by a history of conflict with the victim's family. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Alicia rose immediately. There was no history of conflict. There was harassment by your client, documented in dozens of HOA complaints and police reports. She wasn't afraid. She was obsessed with control. The judge rapped her gavel once. Enough! The jury will decide. During the recess, I stepped into the hallway to clear my head. The building smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. Captain Jameson was waiting near the vending machines. She's going down, he said quietly. The jurors barely looked at her defense. I'll believe it when I hear the verdict, I replied. He studied me for a moment. You ever get tired of being right about people? I gave a humorless smile. Every day. When I walked back into the courtroom, Karen was whispering fiercely to her lawyer. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. She glanced up, saw me returning, and her lips curled. There was something defiant still clinging to her, the last ember of a bully who couldn't comprehend losing. The bailiff called everyone to rise. The jury filed in, faces solemn. My pulse slowed to a heavy, deliberate beat. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge asked. We have, Your Honor. The foreperson stood, paper trembling slightly in her hands. On the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, we find the defendant, Karen Morrison, guilty. On the charge of possession of an unregistered firearm, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. The words landed like hammer blows. For a moment, no one moved. Then a ripple of sound, soft gasps, whispered prayers filled the air. Hannah's grip on my hand tightened again. I didn't cheer, didn't smile. Justice isn't triumph. It's a kind of quiet gravity settling where chaos once lived. Karen collapsed into her chair, muttering to herself. Her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder. She shrugged him off violently. The judge turned to her. Ms. Morrison, you have shown no remorse for your actions. You shot a child in a neighborhood playground and attempted to manipulate witnesses to avoid accountability. The court hereby sentences you to 25 years in state prison without the possibility of parole for the first 15. Karen's eyes went wide. You can't do this! I was protecting myself! The judge's voice was firm. You were protecting your ego. Take her away, the deputies moved in. As they led her toward the side door, she twisted her head toward me, shouting, You think you're a hero? You ruined my life! I stood, meeting her gaze one final time. You did that yourself?" Then she was gone, swallowed by the heavy wooden door and the sound of her own footsteps echoing down the corridor. After court adjourned, neighbors approached us hesitantly. Some apologized, admitting they'd been afraid to speak up about her behavior for years. Others just thanked us for standing up to her. It was strange hearing gratitude for something that had cost my son blood and my family months of peace. But it reminded me that fear thrives in silence, and silence had been broken. Outside, the courthouse steps were flooded with reporters again. This time I didn't speak. Alicia Davenport handled the press, outlining the conviction and praising law enforcement cooperation. I stood off to the side with my family, watching Ethan wave shyly to a cameraman who thanked him for being brave. When the crowd thinned, Alicia walked over. "It's done," she said simply. "Justice?" I asked. "As close as the system allows," she replied. "But you should know this case is going to make waves. HOAs across the state are reevaluating their authority structures." I nodded slowly. "Then maybe something good comes out of it." She smiled faintly. "Maybe." A week later, the world started to feel normal again. Ethan returned home, his shoulder healing well. Lily drew him pictures of superheroes with bandages instead of capes. Hannah planted flowers along the front walkway, saying the house needed new beginnings. I watched from the porch, coffee in hand, as the kids laughed together. For the first time since the shooting, the sound didn't make my chest tighten. It made it loosen. The HOA dissolved under legal pressure. The neighborhood voted in a new council focused on transparency and safety. Karen's old allies resigned quietly, moving away to escape the attention. The fence at the playground was rebuilt, higher now, with a plaque dedicated to community resilience. One evening, Jameson stopped by with paperwork for closure on the case. "You going back to field duty?" he asked. "Not right away," I said. "I think I owe my family some peace first." He nodded. "You earned it." As he left, the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the street where it had all begun. That night, after the kids were asleep, Hannah sat beside me on the porch swing. "The air was cool, crickets humming. You ever think about moving?" she asked. "Every day," I admitted. "But not yet. Running feels too much like losing." She leaned her head against my shoulder. "Then we stay. And we live. That's the best revenge." I smiled at that. She was right, as always. Months later, I received a letter forwarded through the federal office. The return address was a state correctional facility. I hesitated before opening it. The handwriting was jagged but familiar. "Agent Reynolds, I've been told writing to you might help with my parole review someday. I won't pretend I didn't do what they said, but I never meant to hurt anyone. The neighborhood made me feel powerless, and I wanted to feel important again. I'm sorry." Karen M.I. folded the letter once, then again, and set it aside. Forgiveness is a choice, but it isn't an obligation. I didn't feel hatred anymore, just a distant clinical pity for someone who'd confused control with meaning. The next morning, I took the letter to the backyard and fed it to the grill's flame. The paper curled, blackened, and disappeared into smoke. The kids were already running through the grass, laughter echoing in the morning light. Life had moved forward. In the months that followed, I kept working with community programs, helping local law enforcement develop better outreach for HOA disputes, giving talks at schools about de-escalation. Every time I stood in front of a room full of people, I saw Ethan's face in the crowd, the reason I'd chosen to protect, to enforce, to stand between harm and innocence. Karen Morrison's name faded from the headlines, replaced by other stories, other lessons. But for Maple Hollow, the memory remained, a reminder that authority without empathy is just another form of violence. On the anniversary of the shooting, we returned to the playground. The new fence gleamed in the afternoon sun. Ethan kicked a soccer ball to Lily, careful but confident, while Hannah watched from a bench. I stood beside the plaque and read the inscription aloud. "To every family who chose courage over silence." Hannah took my hand. "We did okay, didn't we?" I looked at our children, at the sunlight dancing through the trees, and felt something deep and steady inside me, the kind of peace that isn't fragile anymore. Yeah, I said softly. We did.